August 14th, 2019. Being discounted is getting old. Robert Moore wrote, I'm so sorry to keep asking you niggling little questions, but we want to make sure we get everything right. So, when you got into the car with Don that first time, he told you his name was Bob Martin, and he was the lot boy for Don Lewis. Is that correct? Would it be accurate to say he told you he was the lot boy for a successful businessman, or how would he have worded it to explain why he owns a lot named Don Lewis? I just heard the teaser for the podcast over my dead body. Just had to use the notion of a feud, eh? Sheesh. Shaking my head. I don't remember Don elaborating on his fictitious boss. It was easier for him to remember a lie if he kept it simple. For instance, he almost never called me by my name. He called me Angel. That way, if he accidentally called his wife or his other girlfriend's Angel, it wouldn't raise suspicion. All I recall him saying was that if I needed him, I could call Don Lewis's office and ask the secretary to get the lot boy, Bob Martin. In the course of searching my diary for as much detail on this as I could find, I ran across the first time Linda Sanchez or Gail Rathbone would have seen me. It's attached. I'm guessing about the date being May 1981, but that would likely have been pretty close. I've been around long enough that he knew he could trust me not to be a problem for his family. It was never my intent to have him leave his wife. I didn't believe in divorce at the time. The screenshot attached is the 2019 aerial of the intersection where our office was back in the 80s and 90s. The lot was bordered on the north by East Columbus Avenue and on the south by East Broadway. It was divided in half by 62nd Street. The address was 6038 East Broadway, Tampa, Florida 33619. Don bought it in 1983 for $34,000. It was a deal he did without me, so I had put it in the PSRL land trust that I created for everything he owned that I had not been a partner on back in April 30th of 1992, 6 months after we married on October 10th of 1991. During the conservatorship that followed Don's disappearance, I gave Don's daughters possession of that trust and all it held. That was about $1 million worth of property. Don had asked me to dissolve their trust when they sided with his ex-wife, years after their divorce, to try and get more money from him. I believe family matters and did not dissolve it. I believed one day he'd forgive them. He never did. Don's girls sold that property in 1999 for $65,000. This is all in the public record, as are all of the transactions involved in the probate/conservatorship. I forget where Don lived when I met him, and I didn't see the place except once. It was nothing to write home about. In 1980, he had bought a 150 by 380 foot lot at 1603 Lakewood Drive, Brandon, Florida 33610 for $16,000, where he had Gladys's dream home built eventually. In 1998, Gladys sold it for $223,000. This Google map photo is 2019, but it looks the same. It was about 2,400 square feet, 2-story, 4-bedroom, 2.5 baths. Don said Gladys made him drop his clothes and shoes at the door and change so that he wouldn't mess up any of her antique furnishings. He wasn't allowed to bring anything there except his car. His only pleasure in the place was feeding the wild birds that came to the pond out back. The top screenshot shows the position of the land and the surrounding, mostly trucking industry area. But when Don was there, it was wall-to-wall trailer bodies. Those 8-foot wide by 40-foot long boxes on semis are what he made money doing. He had been fixing washing machines and selling them, but one day he cut the axles off a trailer and sold the axles to a trucking outfitter and then sold the box for storage. That made more money than selling used washing machines. That was what he was doing when I met him. He did some hauling, too. Ann McQueen had been a driver-turned-secretary, but I never knew what he hauled. It didn't seem to be a regular thing with regular routes. I think he had 3 or 4 drivers/mechanics who helped him cut axles and drive loads. I doubt seriously that he was a millionaire when I met him. He had more money than he'd ever had before, but it wasn't a lot of money by most people's standards. Back to the visual of the lot. Everything Don touched looked like a junkyard. In addition to most of the ground being covered by these boxes and pieces of axles and old tires, there were piles upon piles of junk cars, junk boats, and a huge array of lawnmowers to earth movers that were in various stages of being torn down or presumably rebuilt for resale. He went to auctions all the time, but I almost never saw him selling equipment or cars, just buying them and making a mess of them. Our decrepit little love nest was an old RV on the east side of 62nd Street, under that big oak that's still there. It was surrounded by even more of a mess of things that seemed long forgotten based on the vines growing over them. The office was a single wide trailer on the west side of 62nd Street that sits very near where the one is that's there today. That big pole barn was not there back then. The office was as filthy and rotting on the inside as the outside. The entry was a sliding glass door that was nearly impossible to see through for all the grime, and rain had soaked in around the seals such that the doors were in peril of just falling out of their grooves. Every door frame, inside and out, had years of greasy stains from unwashed mechanics' hands leaning on the frames. When you walked in, there were 3 desks. Anne's desk was to the left. The non-Dawn daughter, Luby something, I forget her name right now, was in the middle, and the desk to the right was usually Linda and Gail, 2 of Dawn's daughters. Donna, the 3rd daughter, never worked for him that I recall. To the far right end of the trailer was another office with a desk and rows of old metal file cabinets. There were a total of 6 women working in the office, but only 4 desks for them, so some may have been part-time. To the far left of the trailer, behind Anne, was Dawn's office. Dawn's office had a desk, a phone with multiple lines, and the rest of the room was just a stack of junk that seemed to serve no purpose. I think the bathroom was back there too. The entire place was dark from poor lighting, but what you could see was that everything was covered in a thick layer of dirt and dust. When I would open the file cabinets, there appeared to be absolutely no filing system, and papers were falling out of folders, stuffed into crevices, and even the insides of the cabinets were just thick with dust and roach droppings. A big point of contention between Anne and I in the late 1990s was that I wanted to get us off these paper records and into digital files because so much time was wasted every day searching for things that were almost impossible to find in that sort of a mess. After Dawn and I were married, and I could come and go freely from the office, I can't ever remember catching anyone working. Dawn was always on the phone, but all of the secretaries seemed to be just sitting there with nothing to do. After Dawn disappeared, I fired all of them, and my mother did the work that all 6 of them did for the next 20 years as we rebuilt the business. After the conservatorship ended, our $5 million was down to about $1 million, but my mother and I built it back up to $5 to $6 million that it is now. We did that while having to raise $3 to $4 million a year separately to care for the cats. If there is any doubt in your mind as to who built this real estate business the first time, 1981 to 1997, and the second time from 1997 to 2019, that should resolve the mystery. Nothing about this place made me think I'd hit the jackpot. Dawn and I built the real estate business together, starting with an investment of only $2,000 that I was able to 10x in the first few months. After doing that, Dawn asked me to go find more deals like that, so that's how I spent most of my time. Finding the bad paper, defaulting mortgages from banks, negotiating discounts on what they were owed, mapping out where the properties were, and often taking Dawn with me, then going to the courthouse and doing a title search to make sure there weren't other liens or judgments, preparing the assignment of mortgage to us, recording it in the public records, sending the owners a demand letter, and trying to work out payments for them. If that failed, I'd draft all of the foreclosure proceedings. I taught myself by pulling hundreds of cases, noting the wording of the pleadings, the timing, like having to wait 30 days from filing one thing before I could file the next. Representing us in court pro se, again by sitting for hours in court cases to see what the attorneys did, getting the final judgment, and then setting up the courthouse sale and attending that. Judges were amused by me, I think, and gave me a lot of leeway. Some even gave me advice on dealing with other judges, because some were not as open to a person representing themselves. Dawn often would go to the final sale on the courthouse steps with me. Once we had title to the property, I'd make a for sale by owner sign, and Dawn or I would stick it in the yard. Anne took care of renting out or selling the properties based on the signs and ads we would run. I'd draft the sales contract, the deeds, and the mortgages back to us. I did similar work with the tax deed properties, except that I wasn't dealing with banks. I was just watching to see which properties were being sold for unpaid taxes, and then doing everything else just like a mortgage foreclosure to get clear title. Anything where I did this level of work went into our guardian angel land trust, or was supposed to. It was in the spring of 1997 that I discovered Anne was putting a lot of these assets into other names, including her own. She said Don told her to, but he told me he didn't. I know it's a lot to read, but I hope you will take the time to do it, and to check out the public records, which will show you what I am saying to be true. We did these deals in Hillsborough, Pasco, Polk, Pinellas, Manatee, and Sumter counties. Because women were treated like housewives by most bankers, title companies, and government agencies, I carried a business card that said I was the secretary for C. Stairs. My name was Carole Stairs, and I operated with them as if I was just representing the man they assumed to be C. Stairs. I was so well known in all aspects of the real estate world that when Don and I married, almost everyone assumed Don was Mr. Stairs. I've been dealing with this disbelief that a woman could build such a strong business from the very beginning. 38 years later, it's really gotten old, as have I. This is a later note. This wasn't part of what I said to Robert, but something I remembered later about Don's recklessness. I was driving southbound on I-75, just before Malfunction Junction at I-4 in downtown Tampa. I was probably out looking at properties and was managing Rand McNally maps strewn across the front seat, and who knows what was rolling around inside my head, but I didn't notice the pickup truck behind me until it had plowed into the back of my car. Thinking this a near-death experience, my brain and body went into hyperdrive to keep from careening into other cars. It wasn't enough of a hit to make me lose control, at least not now with the iron grip I had on the wheel, so I assessed the situation around me, and my vision finally locked in on the driver of the truck, who was laughing hysterically. It was Don. When I asked later why he did that, he said it was just his way of giving me a little love tap. Speaking of being rear-ended, I remember another situation, before we were married, where I was riding in the seat next to him. He had his hand on my leg and clearly wasn't thinking about his surroundings outside the car. He rear-ended a woman who was sitting at a stop. Neither car was damaged, but he desperately didn't want her to call the police, so he peeled off a wad of money to get her to ignore the situation. Frustrated at having to pay off the innocent driver, he came back to the truck and blamed me for him being distracted. If you're enjoying my diary, please like, share, and subscribe. You can find other ways to connect to me over at bigcatrescue.org/Carole.Baskin.